Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear colleagues and friends from all over the world. And particularly, this session is learning by the NILE. NILE is the National Institute for Lifelong Education. This afternoon, I'm so happy to have a chance to share and present and introduce of the learning, lifelong learning, particularly preparing for the happy life in the Homo centenarians and the Homo 100 ages. Today, I would like to deepest gratitude for two very distinguished, very well-known in the worldwide, two speakers, and also the two panels. The first speaker is Michael Osborne. He's the professor of the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He's also the co-director of the Pascal. What is the Pascal? Pascal is the place and social capital and learning. So he will deliver the learning series for the future of lifelong learning. He will overview and also introduce the full story but very briefly and smartly. The rise and fall and rise again is the history of the learning city in European countries. So he will deliver the overview and the concept and the principles and the national lifelong learning promotion initiatives in the European countries. And also what is the future directions for the lifelong learning city. So I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Michael Osborne. We had better to welcome with a warm and a big hand.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and may I thank Professor Choi for the invitation. We've worked together quite closely now for some years, and I can think that now she is a very, very good friend and a huge advocate, I should say, of learning cities and the work of Korea, which is paramount in the world. And I'm very impressed that so many of you are still here at the end of this conference, which must be a sign that it's been good. Now, there are two things that I know about learning. Well, maybe I know a few more, but two things. One, you learn a lot at the beginning of a session, and you learn a lot at the end of a session. So what can you learn from that? That you should make sessions short. So a lot of beginnings and a lot of ends. And what do you remember after a session? Well, you remember the thing in the session that's been most impressive, and you remember the things at the end. So you have to make the end of the speech rather good, and you have to try and make sure there's some sort of peak in the speech. So I'll try and do those things, and you can test me afterwards to see whether I've done them. So I'm going to speak about learning cities for the future, and my conjecture is that learning cities are perhaps the future for lifelong learning. Now, we haven't got too much time, so I'm going to proceed fairly quickly. I think I've probably proceeded too quickly because I haven't said where I come from, and this is a picture of the University of Glasgow, which was established in 1451. It's the fourth oldest university in the English-speaking world. And as one of my former presidents used to say to visiting Americans, of course you know it was created 3 years before Columbus left for the Americas. So that told the Americans where they really were. Now, it's been mentioned already that amongst many hats that I wear, rather like the Germans who talk about their hat having 3 corners, I have 3 or more corners to my hat. I have a corner which is the professor at the University of Glasgow in adult and lifelong learning. I also run a research centre there. One of my other hats is being one of the co-directors of Pascal, which, as Professor Choi has said, is a very bad acronym. It's a very bad acronym for the concept of place management and social capital and learning or lifelong learning. So in a sense, it's trying to link these concepts of place, the role of social capital, and how that impacts on learning. And very briefly, Pascal is something that emerged from the OECD's work at the end of the 1990s and the early noughties, as they're called, in relation to learning regions. At that time, the OECD ran a large project on learning regions around the world, and someone said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we couldn't keep this work going somehow? And they had a clever idea when meeting in Melbourne to create an observatory. And then somehow I got involved, so a centre was set up in Glasgow. We also have a centre in South Africa. We have a centre in the US. And most recently, we've set up a centre in Mexico at Tech Monterrey. You'll notice one gap. There's no centre yet in Asia. But maybe before this meeting ends, we may have some offers for a centre here. Okay, what I'm going to talk about, an overview of learning regions and cities. As, again, Professor Choi has indicated, I'll say something about the developments and then the fall, a little bit about the things that are happening in Asia and some of the things that are happening internationally which will lead to new developments. Just a bit about lifelong learning in the brief history. I guess most of you are probably familiar with the concept of lifelong learning, which has been something of a priority for policymakers for maybe 4 or 5 decades now. And it's essentially a recent post-industrial response, a paradigm shift from education and training to lifelong learning, or even life-wide learning. And you'll have heard various familiar mantras, from the cradle to the grave, at any time and any place, the recognition of learning however it is achieved. And you'll have heard why this is an emphasis. You'll have heard terms like globalization, the role of information and communications technology, competitiveness, the need for individual competitiveness, corporate competitiveness, and national competitiveness. And these are the rhetorics that have been used in relation to lifelong learning. And the learning city has come about as one of the responses in order to deliver lifelong learning on the ground. There's a huge amount of work on lifelong learning, and there's a huge amount of work now and many initiatives in various parts of the world in developing learning cities, learning regions, or sometimes even learning city regions. So here again, just for some entertainment, because we need to have some entertainment and some highlights. This is the sort of thing that you'd see if you come to Glasgow. This is my city, my learning city, and just around it, the learning region. And of course, a lot of that learning, as you Koreans know, relates to golf, a very popular activity here, as I understand it. Now, just in terms of what is a learning city, what is it? And very briefly, one can say that it's something which isn't new. The learning city region has been promoted a lot in recent decades, but you can really trace it back maybe 2,500 years to the time of Plato, the idea of the agora, the learning in the marketplace. But more recently, these are the essential foci. One is an economic one. It's about creating, at one level, an underlying infrastructure of education opportunity that might attract inward investment from business. And you would ask the question, why would people come and do business in Seoul? Well, one of the reasons might be that there is a learning infrastructure that supports workers at all levels. Another reason might be that there's a suitable pool of skilled workers that already exists here. Those would be, from the economic perspective, what a learning city might be. But at the other end of the perspective, a learning city is about the ways in which we efficiently bring together a variety of stakeholders in the informal, non-formal, and formal sector to create a network that promotes opportunity, that creates social cohesion and inclusion at a city. And of course, when we look at the different learning city initiatives around the world, we see initiatives that lie at various points of that particular continuum. Briefly, in terms of the history, we can see that there have been a number of phases. That in the 1970s, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, had a project which they called the Educating City, and some 7 cities in different continents around the world became educating cities. In developments through the 1980s and 90s, we saw a number of initiatives that emphasize both the social and the economic actors that are involved in learning city activity. Some of this then was formalized in 1992 at a well-known Gothenburg conference that was also organized by the OECD and led to the creation of the International Association of Educating Cities. Then, as I mentioned before, the OECD had a fairly well-known Learning Regions project with 5 European cities in the period 1992 to 2000 and 1999 to 2002. And out of that, as I've said, the organization that I'm co-director of, Pascal, came about. And again, a lot of activity in the European area came about through a variety of projects, many of which were funded by the European Commission. And if you get this presentation afterwards, you'll find there are a lot of hot links here to these particular initiatives. The TELS initiative was one of the first towards a European Learning Society, and then a range of projects which I list here, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. And the European Commission was very important in relation to the development of the learning city, learning region idea as a manifestation for lifelong learning. And a very important policy paper called The Local and Regional Dimension of Lifelong Learning came about in 2001, and a range of initiatives in the so-called R3L program. R3L, Regions of Lifelong Learning. And just let me quote from that paper and that initiative. There, the learning region was defined as something, a region that goes beyond its statutory duty to provide education and training, and instead creates a vibrant, participative, culturally aware, and economically buoyant human environment through the provision, justification, and active promotion of learning opportunities to enhance the potential of all its citizens. So you see, it's a concept which is very wide-ranging. It's the notion of learning being not just those things that occur within formal institutions, but it's about putting together the resources in an effective and efficient way that cross a range of different entities that cross the formal, informal, and non-formal. So it's talking about learning which occurs in museums or galleries, the role of business, the role of the public sector, the role of the city itself in contributing to learning, and finding mechanisms to efficiently link these particular agencies together. A lot of that in Europe was linked to a range of much more substantial, higher level economic policies, including the famous Lisbon European Council, which set a strategic goal for the first decade of the 21st century for the European Union to become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable growth with more and better jobs and greater cohesion. And the very well-known, at least in Europe, Memorandum on Lifelong Learning, which put emphasis on learning to be tailored to the specific requirements of each region, a recognition that over a large continent, particular areas, particular places have particular needs. And also the paper that relates to making a European area of lifelong learning a reality, which talks about support through EU programs for the establishment of networks between regions and cities with well-developed lifelong learning strategies to facilitate the exchange of experience and good practice. So you can see at a European level a fair amount of organization, the development of particular initiatives, and an attempt to create mechanisms whereby there's exchange of experience between different regions and cities. A number of nation-state initiatives came about as well. Here are some examples. In the UK, in Germany, and Italy, we find learning cities or learning regions networks. And individual cities stand out as making enormous attempts to turn their cities into learning cities. We profile a number of cities, not just in Europe, but in all continents, at our Pascal International Exchanges site. I just single out two cities, Kaunas in Lithuania and Cork in Ireland, where I visited recently, where they have taken on the learning city idea as one of the paramount ways of implementing policy in relation to lifelong learning. So what are the principles essentially then of cities which call themselves learning cities? Well, it is putting the broad concept of learning at the heart of a range of strategies, and a notion that activities across a broad portfolio of services should revolve or stem from learning. So learning being seen as a central idea that underpins work in the environment, work in the social work area, and a range of other services. And the idea that learning and lifelong learning is more effective than economic levers alone for development. We can't just rely on the economists to give us our ideas. We need to have principles that come from learning that are embedded as well. After all, we all know how economists have predicted the future. Not very well. And at that Gothenburg conference that I talked about of the OECD, there was the talk about partnerships and collaborations between interested regions and cities being essential, but also partnership and collaboration with between different agencies in cities are essential principles. And in the R3L Plus project, one of the projects that I mentioned very briefly earlier, the notion of service agreements being created between stakeholders, and that's very important as an underlying principle as well. Well, that was the rise. There's been something of a fall, I have to say. Now, if you came to Europe now, you might find relatively few cities which are calling themselves learning cities. Now, to a certain extent, you could say that was a fall. To another extent, you could say that actually that has been an achievement because the notion of learning cities has been absorbed or mainstreamed into broader strategic policy. And that certainly has been the case in Germany and the UK. But in some initiatives, they have not been sustainable without government funding. A lot of the initiatives that I mentioned before were the result of some input of funding. As soon as the funding disappears, then the initiative disappears. So and often that has been the case, that initiatives have not been strongly enough bedded into agendas of economic priorities around progress and competitiveness. It's also because learning cities are one idea, but how many labels can you think of that are attached to various types of city movements? So we hear about intelligent cities, sustainable cities, educating cities, energy cities, etc., etc. So in many cities, there are competing labels which exist. I would argue, however, that the learning city idea is embedded in all of those. And if you look at some of those principles that underlie eco-cities or future cities or cultural cities, you will see that they're dependent on learning. And I see learning cities and learning as the overarching concept that underpins all of these. So whether the word learning city is actually used, I think the learning city exists through a number of these initiatives. There's certainly been a rise again in Asia, if we look at things in a world way. And there's, in the last decade, new interest in countries like China, Vietnam, Japan, and of course Korea itself. And my reading of this suggests there are various reasons for that. And this is my time for a plug, a memorable moment. A recent issue of the International Review of Education, which is edited by myself and 2 other colleagues, which, amongst other things, has a piece on Korea and Japan. And my reading is that in Korea, learning cities have been a key policy instrument in promoting regional self-governance. In China, they're connected with countering the discontent of citizens in relation to industrialization and post-industrialization, and in promoting improvements in environmental conditions and in regaining cultural dignity. And in Japan, many smaller cities and rural places have developed strategies to attract people into their areas by promoting community-based concepts around culture, creativity, and innovation. And these countries are essentially taking the lead in some work that UNESCO is now doing, creating an international platform for learning cities, which is a potential kite mark standard. In fact, some of us here in the room were in Beijing only 2 weeks ago when the International Platform for Learning Cities was launched. And we see others around the world linking a range of concepts in the context of learning cities. I quote here Goncalves of the idea of learning cities for the 21st century based around 2 key pillars of equity and sustainability. And of course, we mustn't forget the overarching idea of linking the social, economic, and environmental triumvirate in the Rio +20 summit. So these ideas, which are part of learning cities, see themselves played out across a broader area than just simply the narrow concepts of learning as it relates to the formal sector. They're linking themselves more and more to issues of equity, sustainability, and health as well. In fact, we're seeing huge convergence, I think, between learning cities and learning communities and notions of healthy cities, green cities, and cultural cities. And something that we've been trying to do within my organization, Pascal, is to try and bring these concepts together in something we call PI, which is the Pascal Initiative, International Exchanges Initiatives, and something we call EcoWell. And my colleague, Peter Cairns, who unfortunately can't be with us, has put together, in particular, this notion of the EcoWell city. And he says that around the world, cities are confronted by a seeming convergence of forces that underpin key learning, health, environment, and cultural objectives. And this is an opportunity that we can all seize on. This conjuncture of forces to develop in a coordinated, comprehensive way through partnerships and a shared vision, cities that are sustainable, humane, and foster learning and well-being for all. And we see some of that in the work that UNESCO is doing. And here is a typical UNESCO diagram, which is always modeled in this sort of way. The idea of the foundation, the pillars, and the arches. So here, UNESCO is talking about the wider benefits of a learning city, the why, relating to social, economic, and environmental matters, the major building blocks for a learning city, the what, which relate to educational, analytical, and practical methods, and the fundamental conditions for building a learning city, the how, the political, administrative, and resources issue. And if you're interested in hearing more about this, you will find on the UNESCO site, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, much more detail. As I said, we recently met in Beijing. Professor Choi and myself have been part of the expert group for developing learning cities, and there are a range of next steps that are going to be taken, and in particular, those next steps are going to be related to refining key features of instruments that have been created in order to measure, through a range of metrics, the extent to which cities have become learning cities. And the next steps are going to be about focusing on key underlying motivations, which relate to individual empowerment, social cohesion, sustainable development, cultural development, and economic prosperity. The building blocks, which relate to creating a culture of learning, learning organizations, local and international partnerships, innovation and change, and the engagement of contribution of stakeholders. And the essential elements, which are political will, commitment, and good governance. An extra issue, I think, which is very important in terms of future work, is something which is emerging and which I'm interested in to a large extent now, and that's the role of so-called big data. Now, some of you may have heard of the idea of big data. Data that comes from CCTV, from mobile telephones, from what you do in Facebook. Now, with the more sophisticated linking of different data sets which come from those sorts of sources, and linking that to a variety of administrative data, we're going to get much more refined notions of what it is that happens in particular defined places inside cities, and we'll be able much more significantly to understand the nuances inside cities, and we'll be able to understand much more people's behaviors. And a lot of this is about creating environments that can shape people's behaviors in particular ways in relation to their learning habits and performances inside cities. Very soon, we in Pascal are going to take this a little bit further, and if your agenda is free, in 10 days' time, come to Hong Kong, where we're going to be bringing a number of cities together in our conference. And then, if you want a really exotic journey, come to Glasgow, where we will be launching one of our own programs where we're talking about what we're calling Learning Cities 2020. And here we're going to be trying to look to the future and link some of the work that we've been doing on learning cities with some of the findings which some of you yesterday might have heard about in the OECD presentation about adult skills. Because these two things are intimately linked together. Now, to sum up, and one of the advantages that I have in speaking near the end is that I can steal from others. And let me end by saying why I think lifelong learning is important and why cities are vital vehicles in promoting it. Again, for those of you who didn't come to the OECD session yesterday, I'll repeat one thing that I've stolen from Deborah Rosevear, who spoke yesterday, or my interpretation at least of it. Not investing in lifelong learning could lead to decline in skills levels as people get older. And we need older workers in many aging societies such as Korea. If you saw the statistics, and some of you already know the statistics, there is going to be a marked increase in people in the older generation in Korea. And for those of you who haven't seen the PIAC results from Korea, PIAC is the program for the International Assessment of Adult Competences, will not know that Koreans over the age of 40 performed pretty badly in the PIAC work, exceptionally in the OECD countries. And you know that in coming decades, you will need your older people because they will provide a greater and greater proportion of your population. And you need them to work. And you need them to work in different jobs. We don't know the jobs of the future, but we know they will be different, and they need modern generic skills, and therefore you need lifelong learning. Now, we also know that there's some cognitive decline that's inevitable with age. But we also know that learning interventions can have an effect. If you look at the PIAC statistics for my own country, we don't do very well. Except in one category, people between the ages of 55 and 65 do as well as school leavers. Now, what does that point to? Well, either our school system was really good 40 years ago, or we've got pretty good lifelong learning and adult education, which has sustained those skills. That generation that are now aged between 55 and 55 might have been a generation that had good adult learning opportunities, which has meant that they can still perform in later life as well as they did when they left school. Finally, it's important to note that much learning occurs outside the formal sector and is not captured and utilized. There's a role for all sectors, formal, non-formal, and informal, and learning that occurs in various contexts needs to be coherent as one system. And it's cities that are the places where most of us live, and it's the obvious vehicle for creating coherent lifelong learning systems. It's an issue for all stakeholders in civil society, business, and the public sector. And to go back to the theme of the conference, we have to work beyond our walls. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michael Osborne, Professor. His so inspiring and impressive presentation is so never-ending story of the learning city. From the early 1970s, it was rise, and then it was the falling season, and then rise again. Currently, 2013, there are a huge variety of the learning city, learning legends, and learning space. So the one of the worldwide well-known specialist, Professor Michael Osborne, suggested from the wisdom of the past and the present, he would like to suggest the next chapter of the learning city, our future, tomorrow's the vision, and the new initiatives through the partnership and the collaboration. So we learn a lot. We could so insightful lessons from his presentation. So I would like to once again thanks for the so wonderful and fantastic presentation with a big hand. Thank you. And the next speaker is the Professor Ian Baptiste. He came from the Granada. 22 hours long flight. Originally, he was the professor in the University of Georgia, University of Penn State in United States. Now, still, continuously, he never stopped the supervising of the doctoral student in the summer session in Penn State University in United States. Granada is his hometown, his home country. He also very well known, worldwide well known, scholar and academist in the lifelong learning. Today, he will deliver the lecture, the fantastic presentation, Happy Third Age, for whom our main agenda is the lifelong learning in the era of centenarian age. Particularly point out for the preparing happy life. So his presentation will deal with the issue of the LIS. This is the low-income senior. Originally, she prepared the issue of the LIR. LIR means low-income retired. But now, in his new paper, he prepared and revised for the broadened concept of the LIS issue, low-income seniors. So how can we prepare? How can we think about the issue of lifelong learning for the special target group of the low-income senior groups? He prepared a huge variety of the data set, statistics, and so many data he included. So we would like to, his very, very exciting and interesting key issues under the title of the lifelong learning for the happiness of the LIS group. Why don't we welcome his wonderful presentation, Ian Baptiste, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Choi, for these wonderful comments and for inviting me back here. I've been here, this is my third visit, and in two of those occasions, it has been sponsored by the National Institute for Lifelong Learning. I want to thank Ms. Eugene. Oh, she has the patience of, I don't know, I have changed my orientation to this work so many times that I thought she would not even want to speak with me when I got here, but she's a wonderful human being, and I want to thank her. I'm really a draft. I keep telling people this, they don't believe me. I'm really a draft. I am in becoming. What I say now, don't hold me responsible for it, because by the time I get out, I probably will change my mind. So remember this. Now, where do I come from? I have to explain where I come from because it's hard. I come from the Caribbean, and that's the chain of islands you see in here from Florida to in the north, passing through Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and down to Trinidad and Tobago. And if you look closely, you would see Grenada hovering here as a little dot. In fact, you can't see it really. I taught at Penn State for 15 years, and we do football, American football. And the stadium in Penn State seats 110,000 people. On a good football game, there are more persons in the stadium of Penn State than the entire population of Grenada, which is 90,000 people. So we're really small. But that's where I am. That's where I'm coming from. And that's the university that I'm now at. It's St. George's University. It's picturesque. You should come. You need only to give me 24 hours notice, and I will make sure that you enjoy yourself. Let me tell you something about my politics before I introduce this talk. I consider myself to be in the tradition of critical HR scholars. And so that you should take that under advisement when you listen to what I have to say. I also do a lot of work qualitatively, qualitative research methods. And so what I would interrogate here, in the broadest sense of the term, is whether or not lifelong learning is indeed, not should be, is indeed, I'm descriptive, not prescriptive. Whether or not lifelong learning is indeed a human right or a birthright of the few. A human right for all or a birthright for the privileged few. And so I'd like you to, if you don't mind, think about that idea as I go through the slides. So I titled it, A Happy Third Age for Whom? And what I'm trying to do here is examine accessibility of publicly funded health education programs for low-income seniors in the United States. Conceptualizing this study, I had, and working on it, I had two colleagues, one who works with me at St. George's University, Arlette Wildman, she is a clinical psychologist, and a colleague of mine, an adult educator at University of North Carolina at Chapel, Professor Lisa Merriweather. The outline. First, I will introduce the study, then I will describe constraints that low-income seniors encounter as they try to participate in health education programs. Then I will describe and assess an exemplary funded program, health education program, which is called A Matter of Balance, a fall prevention program. And then finally, I would raise some questions for further investigation. So here's the purpose. I want to interrogate the notion of unrestricted choice that is assumed in the rhetoric of happy third age. And I want to do so by examining publicly funded health education programs for low-income seniors in the United States. And by low-income seniors, I mean persons 60 years and over who earn below the official poverty threshold. And here is the start. Low-income, third age is defined as that time in our lives when our children no longer live in our homes and when we begin to plan for the next and probably greatly modified phase of our work life. I don't know what happened there. I wish I... Sorry about that. What I'm doing is a embedded exploratory case study. I'm using content analysis of archival data, mainly US Census data, supplemented by website information from various education providers. And I'm also using telephone interviews with providers to give me the data for making this case. The case is embedded in the following ways. I look broadly at the United States, then one state within the United States, Ohio, then two counties within Ohio, one rural and one urban, Hamilton, the urban, and Noble, the rural. Incidentally, Hamilton is the second largest county in Ohio, and that's where Cincinnati is. And Noble is the second least populous county in Ohio. And within Hamilton, I'm looking at a specific program. So you see the embeddedness of the case. Here are the counties in Ohio, and my focus is on Hamilton here and Noble here. So why am I choosing low-income seniors? Because they are one of the most challenged groups of seniors financially, educationally, and health-wise. Do you know of any low-income seniors? Think about that for a moment, because I'd like you to compare what I have to say with what you know about them. I am making the case, I'm asserting that they are very challenged financially, educationally, and health-wise. And therefore, they are a good test of the rhetoric of unrestricted choice that is embedded in the jargon of a happy third age. Why did I choose the United States? I'm not living there anymore. Because of the ready availability of data on low-income seniors and because of this United States global influence. Why did I choose publicly funded health education programs? Because two of us, myself and Wildman, are both health educators. We teach in a predominantly medical school, and I teach health education together with my colleague Wildman. Because health is a primary concern of all seniors. And I chose publicly funded programs to examine the social contract that society has made with our study population. I believe that society's obligations, social obligations, are manifested in the public programs sponsored by civil society and public and private sectors. The research questions I pose are, what constrains the participation of low-income seniors in the United States in publicly funded health education programs? How are programs tailored to address these constraints, and what challenges do program providers encounter and how they address those challenges? Those are the questions that frame the data I gathered, and here are the findings of that, which is part 2. What I will do is go through what a typical low-income senior looks like in the context of the United States, the kind of a person he or she is and the kind of challenges he or she would face. Permit me not to spend much time on the evidence. The evidence is here, but if I do, it will take a very long time. So I'll make bold claims, the evidence, and go through quickly the evidence, but you can look it up. It's there. So the first I'd like to say is that the typical low-income senior in the United States lives with his spouse. He or she lives with at least one dependent grandchild for whom he or she is the primary caregiver. So the idea of empty nest is gone. And there's a lot of, this is the information that would provide, that would support the claims. I don't have time to go through them, but for Ohio, for the United States, for Hamilton, and for Noble, I have the information. You can see the blue line representing households with grandparents living with grandchildren, the blue, there's a lot of them. The typical low-income senior in the United States has no retirement income and must therefore continue to work for wages and receive public assistance. Across, whether it's the United States, 82%, 82.5%, whether it's Ohio, 79.6%, Hamilton, 82.7%, Noble, 68.4%, are without retirement income. The typical low-income senior in the United States probably did not graduate from high school. And here you can see the stats. I'm going to go through them quickly. Educational distributions, establishing the claim I made, literacy rates. The typical low-income senior in the United States is not likely to own a computer or know how to use one. And if she or he possesses a computer and knows how to use it, there is a high chance that she does not subscribe to broadband internet access. The typical low-income senior in the United States likely suffers from at least one of the following 5 chronic illnesses: heart, cancer, arthritis, diabetes, Alzheimer's. The typical low-income senior in the United States has no employer-assisted health insurance and must therefore rely on public assistance. The typical low-income senior in the United States is severely cost burdened. That's a term, I didn't create that. That's the U.S. Department of Labor. They spend 50% or more of their household income on rent and utilities. That's what it means to be cost burdened. The typical low-income senior in the United States is food insecure. According to the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a food insecure person is one for whom, quote, consistent access to adequate food is limited by lack of money and other resources. Finding herself in such unenviable situation, the food insecure person engages in a financial juggling act where sometimes the football gets dropped. If you're poor in the United States and senior, you are food insecure. Whether you're in town or country, city or state. Part 3. Let's examine programs. We examine a number of programs, nutrition programs, broad prevention programs, and the second one here, community putting prevention to work, is a CDC, Center for Disease Control program that does stuff with gardening, community gardening in cities. There's Healthy You, Healthy Diabetes. But we chose to focus on one specific program, fall prevention. Fall is serious business. In the United States, 30% of adults aged 65 and older living in the community fall each year. An older Ohioan falls every 2 minutes and sustains a fall-related injury every 5 minutes, resulting in 2 hospitalizations each hour, an emergency room visit every 8 minutes, and 3 deaths every day. Fall is serious business in the United States. So this program was put together to address this problem called A Matter of Balance. A Matter of Balance is an evidence-based, award-winning, nationwide program designed to help individuals manage fall risks. It was developed by researchers at Boston University in collaboration with Maine, at the state of Maine, Health Partnership for Aging. In Ohio, the program is coordinated by SteadyU, a division of the Ohio Department of Aging. And in Hamilton County, where we spend most of the time looking, it is administered by the Hamilton Fall Prevention Task Force with funding from the Hamilton County Public Health Department. We asked the following questions of the program. How is A Matter of Balance tailored to address the constraints that I just went through? And what challenges do program providers encounter? How they address them? We got data from the websites and from phone interviews and so on. This is the instrument we use. I wouldn't go through it. It's findings. Program description. The program typically runs for 8 weeks, 1 hour per week. 2 trained coaches facilitate each session. One is usually a peer tutor, somebody who has fallen and gotten up and now is able to help others. Marketing is conducted via posters, flyers, and presentation at, to, and by agencies and organizations frequently visited by low-income seniors, such as senior centers, community centers, retirement homes, libraries, and so on. A few providers rely on social media, newspaper articles, and local television, but most of it is face-to-face via the methods I suggested earlier. The program seldom supplies transportation, so providers try to deliver the training at locations close to residents' home, such as senior centers and so on. Some programs are delivered on site, at apartment complexes in which the seniors reside. Location and duration of sessions are adapted to the audience. For example, 42 minutes, 40 to 60-minute presentation for small groups who just want some information. The full program, 8 weeks, for persons who are more interested. And they sometimes adjust the program to fit a 4-week format instead of 8 weeks, depending on the exigencies of the senior citizen. The first 2 sessions are devoted to the nature, fear, and experiences of falling. The tools are videos, and you can go on the websites and find them. And coach-led discussions. They also have in-home assessments and visitations and so on. The remaining 8 sessions, the remaining 5 sessions, are physical exercises, and the tools are coach-led demonstrations, sometimes with the aids of physical and occupational therapists and EMT personnel. Findings, strengths. Providers are well aware, actually, of the constraints that low-income people face, seniors face, and they consider them in program design and implementation. Marketing strategies are often adequate. Learning objectives, reasonable. Learning activities are appropriately pitched, interactive, adequately paced, and adaptable to the learner situation. The adequate learner support is provided in the form of adjustments to the pacing, demonstrations, instant feedback, home assessments, one-on-one, and out-of-classroom assistance. And due to the long, and this is critical, due to the long-term community involvement of providers, there's a certain amount of trust that is built between them and the low-income senior to ensure receptivity of the program. So they're pretty good programs. Weaknesses. Overworked and underpaid staff. Heavy staff turnovers, typical of social service programs. Program does not cater to the more physically challenged but still mobile seniors. The group format may not be good for the shy individuals. You might have to do some things. This one is interesting. I learned this while doing this. Younger seniors don't wish to be grouped with older seniors. So it might be a good idea to segment the groups when doing these programs. Classes are often offered only on evenings, so the suggestion to add classes at different times would be a good idea. There's no data currently on the proportion of eligible low-income seniors that attend these programs, but anecdotal evidence suggests that it is less than 10%. Findings, opportunities. So there's a huge potential for numeric growth of these programs. We can build on the initial successes and nationwide reputation. There's not much technical difficulties associated with adapting the program to a new group of seniors. Here are the threats. Not enough training venues in Hamilton, 13 throughout the county. It's a large county. And this is the crux of the matter. Insufficient and unreliable funding. This is a quote. There's still a challenge to get adequate, reliable funding for preventative, that is to say, non-medical measures or care. So here are my conclusions. The program boasts of relatively well-trained, dedicated staff. The program is technically sound. Service providers are doing the best they can with the little they have. We, the authors of this paper, were pleasantly surprised that the life circumstances of low-income seniors are not the major threat to the program's success. The major threat to the program's success is insufficient and unreliable funding. It is the state and not civil society that is reneging on its social contract. So, how do we respond to this issue? I bring you some contribution from cultural historical activity theory. which says that resolving contradictions which are ubiquitous is one of the greatest sources of change. The challenge, therefore, is to accurately identify the nature and sources of contradictions and to find ways to resolve them. Chat doesn't help me do that, but let me tell you what I perceive the contradictions to be. Health prevention programs are costly, and demonstrable positive outcomes tend to be long-term and less dramatic than treatment programs. Politicians and lawmakers, those who are responsible for allocating the resources, are rewarded for short-term dramatic outcomes, not long-term, less dramatic outcomes. So just like the rest of us, elected officials whose responsibility is to allocate fundings are likely to put their own job security over long-term preventative care for low-income seniors, who, by the way, are one of the most vulnerable and least politically powerful groups in their constituencies. That's the dilemma. That's the contradiction, as I see it. So how do we address these contradictions? I say, first, and I'm using organizational theory to help me do this, we should not demonize the individual politician or lawmaker. We must treat this issue as organizational behavior and not individual behavior. In this case, it is the organization. The organization is the state and its subsidiaries. So I think it is a matter of legitimacy. Institutional theory of organization argues that there are three sets of mechanisms by which organizations institutionalize and legitimize their practices. The first is mimicry. Organizations do whatever other organizations do because they don't seem to know anything else. The second is moral suasion, normative or internal motivation, doing what seems best, assessing the various options and doing what seems ethically right, even though it might be politically costly. The third is coercion, external motivation, in other words, taking the path of least resistance, a cost-benefit analysis in which the benefits of underfunding preventative care for low-income seniors outweigh the negative consequences. So I end with this question. In the case of underfunding of health education for low-income seniors, which form do you think of legitimation currently operates? Mimicry, coercion, moral persuasion, all of the above, some of the above? And which forms do you think is likely to change the practice? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ian Baptiste. He proposed and suggested a lot of the inspiring points for the low-income seniors issue of the health education and the issue of the education for the life. But it is not the medical issue. It's the issue of the social contract, matter of legitimation and the institutionalization of the health education. And also, it is also the very critical issue of the underfunding for them. We understand we have also the very similar situation in Korea. So we learn the many insightful lessons from the Ian's presentation. So now I would like to once again thank for his so interesting case study output and also the fantastic presentation. Now we have 35 minutes more from now. So I would like to quickly invite the next two so famous discussion panels. The first panel is the Professor Lee Hee-soo. He's the professor and also the dean of the Graduate School of Global HR Development in Jung'ang University. So now I'd like to invite the 7 or 8 minutes as a panelist for those 2 speakers' presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so encouraged to speak in Korean or English. Dr. Bai? Okay. I'd like to say just 3 points to Dr. Osborne. May I ask you just one question? What's your biggest decision in your life? Yeah.
I think the biggest decision of my life was to not become an industrial chemist, but become an educator.
Thank you. Dr. Richard Florida said that each year to live. It is the biggest decision to year to live. I'd like to, my first point is that the future does not come to us. We do not go to the future. I think we should invent the future. I ask, what is your future of city? Is it equal city, your health city, our learning city? I think there are many kinds of city identities. You told us it's the era of convergence. Yeah, convergence is very popular concept in our country. We want the identity of learning city. My second point is that you told us big data. Big data is a popular term in our country. I think big idea is more important than big data. What is your big idea or master concept in all kinds of cities, green city, health city, learning city, safe city, culture city? I want to ask you, what is the big idea of our cities? Would you answer to us? Yeah.
I think that the overarching big idea relates to the really one fundamental challenge for the future of this world. And the fundamental challenge for me, and actually I think it's the fundamental and should be almost the most important thing that we deal with in the field of educational lifelong learning, and that's the issue of climate change and the issue of the environment. Because if we don't deal with that issue and if we don't take it really seriously, this world will end. There won't be any other learning. There won't be any health because we won't be here. So fundamentally, I think that that over the whole curriculum, over everything we do, whether it be in the formal sector or whether we do it in less formally within cities, we should be promoting the notion of environmental sustainability, resistance to climate change, and we should be shaping people's behaviors to behave in much different ways through learning.
Okay.
I think, within that context, learning is still the top idea, but learning as it relates to this big issue, which nothing else is more important in my mind. So if you want a big idea, it's And we've tried to integrate some of those ideas around learning and the environment, and also linking it to health and economic issues as well in the eco-well model.
Okay. My third point is to place the focus of learning cities in terms of your continuum model from the focus of from economic focus to social justice focus. You ought to place the focus of learning city policies. Of course, it's up to the context of policy and the situation of the cities. But I'd like to ask you, in Korean context, you ought to place the focus of learning city policies on your continuum model.
Where would I place?
Yeah.
Where would I place learning? In the Korean model? Well, I think from what I understand, and I don't want to pretend that I understand Korean learning city completely, but I think probably the Korean learning city developments are somewhat like some of the German learning city developments, in as much as they're somewhat variable in terms of their focus. And in the sense, and I know the German system better than I know the Korean system. From what I know is that the definition that has been applied within learning city developments has used the learning city as an overarching concept that covers a whole range of different initiatives. And sometimes those initiatives are relatively small initiatives, and sometimes they're big and all-encompassing. And I think it's relatively rare, whether it be here or whether it be anywhere else in the world, for learning cities to be truly trying to encompass all the different elements, whether they be economic, social, cultural, environmental. So we find the label of learning cities being used sometimes in a somewhat liberal way. And I may have misunderstood the Korean system, and I think it's probably for you in Korea to respond to that. But I think a lot of things have been brought into the soup, as it were, and not all of them are comprehensive. So some will be economically focused, some will be more socially focused. But as I said in my presentation, it seems to me from a policy perspective, they've been part of a policy for giving greater autonomy to initiatives at city and regional level.
Thank you for your good answer. But I'd like to propose you that lifelong learning or learning city has become a new social movement here. So I'd like to analyze learning city phenomenon as a new social movement. So it's time to analyze learning city phenomenon as a new social movement rather than to propose the index of lifelong learning city. How do you think about my proposal?
I think that's a good proposal for you to put to UNESCO, for sure. I think measurement, we get a bit obsessed with measurement, and we get a bit obsessed with league tables. And the danger with using indices is that countries will want to be able to say, we've got the best learning city in the world because we meet these metrics. We're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing that. Okay, there's some benefit in cities using metrics to be able to see how well they're doing, but the tendency will be, and this is maybe a prediction, my bit of futurology, maybe we'll see a league table. But of course, then everyone works to the league table. From an academic perspective, of course, that your idea of learning cities and analyzing learning cities as a new social movement would be an interesting analytical way to deal with this. I think that would be probably more prevalent in Korea and China than it would be in the European context. And if we look to other parts of the world, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And I talk to people, say, in the US, never heard of it, don't know what it is. Latin America, they don't know what it is. So I think it's a very specific context-laden notion. Certainly, though, as I say, I think probably here and in other Asian countries, it's clearly embedded as a part of a clear, centralized government policy.
Thank you so much. It is very unusual and special type of the discussion. Professor Yi suggested 3 fundamental questions about the next chapter of the real learning city, even in the Korean context and also in the global context. And also, finally, she suggested, how about the new type of the social movement? So, instead of the key features of the UNESCO established. So thank you so much. So insightful and very interesting style. Maybe it's Lee Hee-soo professor's style instead of the Gangnam style. It's very Korean. Thank you. And finally, I would like to invite Professor Han Jun-sang. He's the emeritus professor of Yonsei University. He is also so distinguished scholar. I would like to call him Korean never finding genius scholar, Professor Han Jun-sang's panel session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choi. Well, Dr. Choi gave me actually it's 10 or 15 minutes, but I think 10 minutes enough for me. I really appreciate Mr. Osman for understanding the concept and historical development of a lifelong cities, and also is how it is currently managed in England and the other European countries. Further, I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Baptiste for apprehending on how low-income seniors are managing and making their livings in the United States. Unfortunately, I can make precise comments on each presentations. I also believe that there shall be no serious arguments because simply I am out of their context and their environment. And furthermore, I do have a different cultural background myself. Instead, I cordially ask some questions to each presenters, even it is total gibberish. First, Mr. Baptiste clearly made his statement to us that low-income seniors aged over 60s need both money and work for their survival. This is the result from not able to obtain enough public assistance in the States. This is a very common picture and reality phase you can see in Korean society as well. Korean seniors are not well prepared for their retirement in terms of saved up financial securities, nor continuous jobs. Public assistance is very much limited in Korea as well. Senior low-income Korean seniors finally questions, even they're shouting out that what is it all about with the third age for whom and what, without having enough money and work for survival. Then I asked Mr. Baptiste about if you could give us any helpful and decent suggestions to the seniors to find proper jobs for their survivors. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Osborne, these times, you are saying that lifelong cities can survive or be sustainable without government funding. I don't have any objection to these propositions. However, I do have an objection to your proposition that lifelong learning is a more effective economic tools alone for social and economic development. I believe there are many cases in Korea and the Asian countries where those cases will contradict to your statement today. Would you please provide me your opinion and the thoughts about my questions? Would you like to answer and elaborate more to my question? Please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, also the Professor Han proposed some of the very critical issue and questions for both of speakers. So could you please some inspiring answers and feedback for Professor Han's question? How about the first? I would like to invite Ian. Okay? Yeah.
If I have any suggestions about how low-income seniors in Korea can get proper jobs, the answer is no. I have no such question. But I will provide a framework for you to answer the question. The framework begins with the notion of social contract. I mentioned it a couple of times in the paper. I believe in the notion of social contract, that society makes a contract with its individuals and vice versa. In the context that I'm speaking about, seniors have worked all of their lives. They got to 60 or 65. They've provided so much for our countries and for our villages and for our towns that we have a responsibility for them. They shouldn't be working in the sense that you're describing. So I'm saying, no, we should find ways to ensure that they live a happy life. And that begins with understanding that you have to provide not just money, but other kinds of resources. And they deserve to have it. I'm not making no apologies for saying this. They've worked hard to have where we are now. We owe it to them. So we should do that. And if the Korean senior is anything like the American senior, we have to start talking about basic education for them, because they didn't, we have to talk about providing, the kinds of resources that will get them into the information age and so on, computer and digital literacy. We have a whole lot of things that we owe them as a point of social contract. If we do that, they'll find their jobs. They're very creative, So that's my response. We, as a society, have a responsibility for them, and because they have fulfilled their responsibility to us.
Thank you. And next, how about Mr. Osborne?
You guys are tough. Good Korean style. Just your first question. Can learning cities exist without government funding? Well, it would be preferable if learning cities were underpinned by funding from the state. And obviously, in many initiatives, that's happened. And certainly, as I was saying, there's often been startup funding to do that. But the reality in many states is essentially the state is withdrawing its support for learning, especially post-school learning. In my own country, essentially, well, I talk about my own country. I live in Scotland, but I'm English, so I'll talk about England. The state has effectively withdrawn funding for higher education entirely. It's almost a complete quasi-private system in the UK since fees have been compulsory at all universities. And in terms of funding that's been provided for adult education, that's virtually nothing. The state has taken the decision in a time of crisis what its priority should be, and the priority is youth. The challenges of youth unemployment have become the priority. So the state has withdrawn what little funding it's given to adult education beyond the university sector. So, yes, we would like learning cities to happen without government funding, but the reality in many states is that it's just not going to happen. Yeah, there may be some startup funding, but that's going to be it. So the responsibility has really got to be with citizens, with civil society, with informal groups. And I think we're beginning to see that. We're beginning to see, and I wouldn't have wished it necessarily to have happened in this way. We're seeing, certainly in the UK, and we've seen it historically in the US as well, citizens have to self-organize. And they have to self-organize effectively in coalitions, I would say. And you could have an analogy that a learning city could be a coalition of various forces in civil society that is more efficiently using resources which itself creates. And I think that's got to be the reality. So my answer to you is, in relation to that first question, can learning cities exist without government funding? Probably it is preferable if there were some state intervention, but the reality in many states is that that's not going to happen, particularly in Europe and North America. Now, your second question was, you were questioning my notion as to whether lifelong learning might be more effective than economic tools alone. Well, I think just to expand on that, I'm not suggesting that one doesn't need economic tools. Obviously, one needs a range of interventions that are going to create jobs, essentially. But as we've seen in this recent PIAC study, many people are just not prepared to do those jobs. They don't have the skill sets. Or there's a I don't know if you saw the presentation yesterday. Across many societies, there's a complete mismatch between the skill sets that individuals have and the jobs that are being created. So you can put into place economic tools that will create jobs, but you've got to have some lifelong learning as well, especially in societies where there is an aging population that is essentially going to be dominant in society. And as the point I was making, you know, older and older people in societies like this are going to have to do those jobs. There's no question about that. So you've got to do some retraining, and you've got to create some lifelong learning opportunities for them. So that, I'm not suggesting so so yeah, I won't repeat myself, but that's my response.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We learn a lot from the two speakers and the two panels about the learning city and the lifelong learning in the future, and also the learning right for the low-income seniors. So now I'd like to, we have 10 more minutes from now. So I would like to invite some comments and good questions from the floors. Could you please join? Is there any good questions or some inspiring comments? Okay. Please, before your question or comment, please please introduce yourself first. Mike, please. Yeah. Is there any other extra mic, please?
예, 충주 여중에 근무하는 김성국입니다. 제가 드리고 싶은 말씀은 저는 좀 초점을 삶의 질에다가 좀 맞춰줬으면 합니다. 예를 들면 어떤 생존의 문제도 물론 중요하지만은 그 지금 대개 토론이 어떤 그 예산 지원 문제, 생존 문제 뭐 이런 쪽인데 사실 교육도 잘만 하면 돈이 필요가 없을 수 있습니다. 본인이 노력을 하면은 저는 교육이 돈 갖고 된다고 생각을 하지 않습니다. 반드시 자기의 어떤 성찰이 있으면 반드시 자기를 업그레이드 시킬 수 있다고 보는 것입니다. 그래서 좀 더 그 사람들을 좀 더 희망을 불어넣어주고 그다음에 스스로가 교육할 수 있는 분위기라든가 어떤 그런 사회적으로 행복한 행복한 쪽으로 삶의 질을 올리는 쪽에서 과연 가장 중요한 부분이 무엇인지 좀 대답을 해주셨으면 고맙습니다.
Could you understand what he proposed? Quality of life and the learning for the happiness as the next chapter of the lifelong learning. It is not the issue of the economic and the funding and the money. It is the issue of the life and the people and the happiness. So, how's your opinion about his question, please?
If I give the impression that we can solve the problems of low-income seniors simply by providing money, then I haven't done a good job. I started by examining the programs, actually, that low-income seniors had, and I expected to find them atrocious. I thought that they would be very bad. I was pleasantly surprised that they're actually really good pedagogically and otherwise. So I had to look to other sources for reasons why they were failing. So I am actually saying that educators are doing a damn good job on this particular issue. I mean, we do bad jobs in other ways, but with the little that they have in the state of Ohio to do the work of providing education for lifelong learning, I am saying that they're doing a good job. They need support. That's the point I'm making. They need a lot more support, and that's where funding comes in. They need other kinds of support too. But I focus on this because that's what came from the study. When you talk to coaches and coordinators of this program, they're saying, we can't provide transportation. That's why 10% of the people are here. We can easily get 50% if such and such happen. We know we have the trust. We know we have the relationship, we've built it with those people, but we don't have enough centers. So I am not suggesting that we can do all of this just by proposing money. We have to innovate, we have to get better designs in the programs. But I am making the case that they are actually doing pretty well with the little they have.
Is there some comment? Okay.
If I understand the question correctly, it's a question that relates to the purposes of lifelong learning, and it's quite clear that the purposes of lifelong learning are not simply purposes to do with economic development. Of course, for many individuals, there is an economic necessity to partake in lifelong learning in order to secure a better job, a job at all, etc., etc. But especially when we're talking about later life, notwithstanding what I've said about the need for older citizens to be working in this country, then lifelong learning is connected very intimately with well-being, happiness. Yeah, it would, we would from the Western perspective, we would think a phrase that links lifelong learning or learning of any sort with happiness rather cynically. Yeah, but yeah, what is wrong with that? I mean, we want people to be happy, don't we? And why shouldn't they be happy? We want them to be contented. We want them to feel well-being. And what's well-being? It's the fact that most of the time, if you're asked the question, are you feeling well? You say, yeah, most of the time I'm engaged in something which is satisfying. My life essentially has got some meaning. And we want people to feel that way. And of course, what we should be thinking about is what can learning do there? How can learning make people feel more well? Does it make them feel more happy? Does it make them feel more contented? Does it make them feel more part of society, less in danger, less isolated? Especially when we think about older people, certainly in Western societies, the worst thing for most people is isolation. You know, we've just had a survey about this, and a very large number of older people see no one. All they have is their cat or their television. And they're sad. They are really sad. And learning is one way in which we can bring people together. And this is why I was so unhappy, I have to say, with the demise of the university role in adult and continuing education for older people in the UK. We had probably the best system in the world. I think Ian knows it and probably knows. We had a fantastic system, and which is completely gone because of our obsession with things which have got more value, you know, of winning more money. And that's partly because the state has withdrawn so much from universities, so that things like this don't seem to have a financial value. But of course they do, because we know that there is an enormous financial value that goes with caring for older people by giving them opportunities to get into learning. And one of my friends and colleagues, some of you will know him, Tom Schuler, who was professor at adult education at the University of Edinburgh and then went on to work for the OECD. He makes some simple calculations. Imagine that by engaging older people in learning, then even for 4 less weeks, they're in a care home. Think of how much you save for each individual, and think of how much the economy saves from that. I know it's a crazy calculation, but it's the calculation that some policymakers will probably listen to. The point is that the primary purpose of offering learning in later life is about improving people's social conditions, combating feelings of loneliness, isolation, etc., etc. But even that has got an economic benefit. So I think the arguments are very clear in relation to that. So I hope I've answered your question in part.
Thank you so much. Is it enough? Okay. Almost it's the time. We must conclude. But I would like to 1 or 2 more questions and comments from the floor. Okay, please.
저는 신학대학원에서 종교 역사학을 강의하고 만 70세까지 한 교회에서 은퇴를 한 원로 목사에 속합니다. 이번에 이 포럼에 와서 깜짝 놀랐습니다. 이렇게 귀하고 좋은 포럼이 있었는가. 시간 어제부터 지금까지 너무 감동적으로, 또 어떻게 이렇게 세계 석학들을 다 불러 모아서 우리에게 이렇게 좀 행복한 시간을 주었는가, 참으로 감사합니다. 근데 저는 좀 엉뚱한 질문을 하는 것을 용서해 주시길 바랍니다. 어제 오늘 쭉 이제 교육적으로나 뭐 직업이나 청년 인재 양성이나 이 모든 교육을 방법과 얘기를 하는데 크게 하나 빠진 것이 있다고 생각합니다. 뭐냐면 사람은 육과 영이 있는데 육의 문제만 이틀 내내 다루었습니다. 그런데 더 중요한 것은 제가 전공한 분야가 영이니까 영은 어떻게 다스려야 하는지, 그래서 앞에 발표하신 2분과 또 토론하신 2분과 또 사회 맡으신 원장님께서는 어떤 종교를 가지신지 그건 자유입니다만은 우리의 이 모든 프로그램이 결국 영의 문제와는 어떻게 접목이 되어졌으면 좋을까, 이것 질문입니다. 죄송합니다.
Thank you so much. It's so inspiring and a very fundamental issue of the learning itself. So I would like to invite the Professor Osborne. Is there any good idea or the comment she suggested about it? embodied learning and the spiritual issues of the learning. How can it convergence of the body and the spiritual issue in lifelong learning? Is there any good idea already?
You probably should be asking that question of a very good friend of mine, Professor Peter Jarvis, who is an eminent professor of lifelong learning and who's also a minister in the Church of England. And he's written extensively on this topic of lifelong learning and the spirit. Well, I suppose different religions have different notions of what spirit is. And I think my response is earlier in relation to well-being, to an extent covered that area. So if spirit is something which is not simply about our improving the quality of our bodies, and in essence the physical, that it's about the mind, and it's about our day-to-day feelings about the world, which is a very general definition, then clearly that's immensely important. The psychological domain, our feelings about ourselves, our feelings about the world, and our feelings about where we stand and where we're going to be are very important. So if I agree with you completely that this is something that we should be thinking about, and certainly we'll be very limited in our thinking if we just think about our material goods.
He fully agreed with your suggestion, but unfortunately, we have not enough time. It is already the end of our discussion. So, is there something to comment?
I was going to say, actually, the very first speaker did speak about spirit directly, President, Prime Minister Barack. I like to think about spirit as the pursuit of meaning and purpose. If that is the case, education is entirely wrapped up in the idea of things spiritual. If we have not, and I agree with you, if we have not made specific reference to how education assists us in making meaning of our lives and purposes for our lives, I think we have made a grave mistake. And so when I look, as I told you at the beginning, my work is a draft, and my life is a draft. So when I look at my paper again, I would have to update it to make sure that there is a specific focus on how education, even at in the context of what seems to be very material, health, brings about meaning to people's life. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Is there any other final question or the comments from the floor? Thank you so much. Oh, yeah. Professor Fang, could you please very briefly
네.
suggest the
네, 오늘
comments?
네, 황기석입니다. 너무나 좋은 말씀 많이 주셨고 그동안 공부 많이 했습니다. 오늘 이번 시간의 주제를 통해서 생각하는 것이 참 많았던 시간인 것 같고요. 다 모든 사람들이 부모님이 계시고 또 노인에 대한 복지 문제와 교육 문제가 우리가 개인적인 차원에서 해결하지 못하는 부분들도 참 많은 것 같습니다. 여기 앞에 계시는 위대한 교수님들은 앞으로 향후에 우리나라 평생교육 정책의 방향에 중요한 역할을 하시는 분들이시기 때문에 앞으로 이게 유럽에서는 노인의 교육에 대한 재정적인 지원이 거의 없어지고 있다 그러는데 우리나라에서는 노인에 대한 그 학습에 대한 평생학습에 대한 지원 이런 것들은 정책을 제안하신다면은 어떻게 제안하실 건지 궁금합니다.
How about the Professor Han and the Professor Lee? As your final remarks and comments, please, some.
You are the right person to answer to her questions.
I think it's very difficult and the realistic issues for the education for later part of the life in the years of the centenarian age. So I would like to conclude my remarks as follows. It should be lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. From the cradle to the grave, our learning will be continued. There is no terminal. There is no ending point. There is no final last pages. So today, we discuss during the 2 and more hours, but it is just initiating, starting point. So there is no right answer. There is no only one answer in the issue of lifelong learning. So thus, we should do our best for creating the lifelong learning world in Korea and the global village. In terms of the people first, by the people, for the people, of the people, lifelong learning will be our ultimate goal for development of the growth of lifelong learning. So in this session, myself also learned a lot. It is so inspiring and so impressive and very precious time for all of us. So the joy of learning is one of the NILE's very, very important slogan. Very old Chinese wise man, Confucius says, the joy of life is our ultimate goal of life. So we will do our best. If you go fast, you will go alone. But if you go far, you will go together. So all the participants, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to join and actively participate our learning session. Thank you so much.